Hey guys, tonight we are slipping into a story that drifts as easily as a Viking longship on calm waters. Picture the North Sea above you, a sheet of black silk sprinkled with stars that stretch all the way to the edge of your imagination. The air is cold and salted, your breath a faint mist in the night. You probably wouldn't survive this journey. Not with those flimsy sneakers and a phone battery already at 9%. The Vikings would laugh at your gear before tossing you on oar. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing the comments from all over the world. It makes this sleepy voyage feel like a little global campfire. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stars above the northern seas are unlike anything you've ever seen. You lie on the damp wooden deck of a Viking longship, rocking gently with the swell. The sky doesn't just hold a few bright dots. It's a river of light, the Milky Way bending across like a glowing highway. You trace its patterns with your finger, though no one's watching. Well, except maybe the helmsman, who pretends to scowl but secretly smiles at your wonder. Historians still argue whether Viking sailors truly navigated by the stars in a systematic way, or whether they relied more on coastal landmarks and sunstones. Either way, the sky serves as their ceiling, map, and nightlight all at once. The constellations whisper ancient names. Ursa Major, Orion, the Pleiades. You follow them, feeling your body sink deeper into rest as your mind drifts into the rhythm of the waves. You catch the sound of water slapping the hull. The planks are made of oak, painstakingly overlapped in what shipwrights call clinker-built style, like wooden fish scales that flex with each wave. This overlapping design keeps water out, but also lets the ship glide faster than most vessels of the era. Mainstream history tells you these ships could travel over 100 miles in a single day with favorable wind. You don't need the number. You can feel the speed, the way the long, narrow shape cuts cleanly through the water. Your nose fills with the briny scent of seaweed, tar, and with smoke from the torches flickering at the prow. A seabird cries overhead. A gull, or maybe something more dramatic, like a raven that somehow wandered far from shore. The crew chuckles. Someone jokes that Odin is checking in, making sure you're awake enough to row when it's your turn. You smile, though you know you won't be touching in, or tonight. The night sea is a strange companion. You half expect sea monsters to ripple out from below, those long-bodied serpents from Norse tales that sailors swore they glimpsed when the waves rolled too high. And here's your first quirky tidbit. There's an Icelandic story about sailors mistaking the heaving back of a whale for an island. They landed, cooked a meal, and only realized too late that the island was moving. You shift a little uneasily on the planks, half imagining the ship beneath you belongs to some gigantic fish dreaming in the dark. The cold air seeps into your bones, but you draw the fur cloak tighter. You wonder how these men, tough, scarred, missing more than a few teeth, handle this every night for weeks on end. They share salted fish and ale, joke about raiding, then fall asleep on bare boards. Their lullaby is the creaking timbers and the slosh of water. Your modern self will be miserable, but their world accepts hardship as casually as you accept ads before YouTube videos. Remember, you're not here to fight. Not here to raid. You're here to drift, to let the details wash over you like foam on the sand. You close your eyes for a moment and hear it all. The slap of water, the murmur of voices, the crackle of fire. One sailor hums a half-forgotten tune. Something about Freyr blessing the harvest, or maybe about the girl he left behind weaving by lamplight. As the ship rocks, you notice how time itself feels stretched thin. It doesn't matter if the stars are fixed or if the sea is endless. What matters is that you're afloat, surrounded by stories, swallowed by the vast silence of the north. A silence that somehow manages to be noisy, with wind, waves, and wood, yet also calming. You smile, letting the edges of your awareness soften. Tonight, the Vikings row, steer, and laugh. You simply lie back, cradled by the sea, your imagination riding with them. The prow ahead points toward new shores, but for you, the journey is inward, into dreams, into rest. The first thing your drowsy eyes catch in the morning gray is the shape at the ship's very front. Not the mast, not the sail, Not even the painted shields hanging along the sides. It's the carved dragon staring forward, its wooden snout stretched into the mist. Its teeth are exaggerated, jagged, and a little ridiculous if you look too long, like a puppet frozen in mid-roar. But you don't laugh, because the way it looms against the horizon gives you goosebumps, and not just in the cold spray. Mainstream accounts tell us these dragon heads, or Drekker, were deliberately dramatic. They were meant to intimidate anyone standing on shore as the longship approached. Imagine living in a peaceful coastal monastery and suddenly spotting that carved head peeking through the fog. It would be like seeing a horror movie trailer come to life. Only you don't get the option to close the laptop. You'd be packing your bags before the oars even touch sand. Historians still argue whether every Viking ship carried such figures, or only those intended for raiding. Some believe that merchant ships avoided them, lest they frighten friendly harbors. Others think the dragons were interchangeable, slotted in before a journey and removed at will, like hood ornaments on a car that you could snap off when visiting grandma. Either way, the sight is unforgettable. Half art, half threat, fully mesmerizing. You lean closer, almost able to smell the resin that keeps the wood sealed against seawater. You can trace with your eyes the grooves where a craftsman's chisel bit into oak. The lines curl like waves, spiraling around the dragon's eyes, giving them an illusion of movement. The prow doesn't just sit, it snarls forward, dragging you with it. Here's the quirky bit. Some sagas say that the dragons weren't always about scaring people. They might have been designed to scare away the land spirits of the new places where Vikings landed. The Norse believed in Landvetter, protected beings who guarded coastlines and farms. Supposedly, arriving with a fierce dragon head could chase those spirits away, clearing the ground for new settlements. Which means the carving wasn't just decoration. It was spiritual pest control, a sort of supernatural eviction notice. The ship rocks, and you keep staring at the head as though it might blink. You wonder if the crew believes in its power. Some touch it before meals, like rubbing a lucky charm. Others don't look at it at all, as though ignoring a dangerous neighbor. The helmsman gives you a half-smile. "It watches," he mutters, "so we don't have to." You can't tell if he's joking. You close your eyes, but the shape stays with you. The long curve of the neck, the tilt of the head, the eerie way it seems to cut through fog before the ship even moves. You picture villagers far ahead, glimpsing that silhouette against the rising sun. They'd freeze, drop their buckets of water or their baskets of bread, and whisper to each other, "The dragons are here." And yet, in this moment, with you drifting somewhere between wakefulness and dream, the dragon feels oddly comforting, a guardian as much as a menace, standing watch at the prow like a wooden nightlight. You breathe with the waves, feeling your body sway. The dragon, toothy and silent, leads you on. The ship rocks gently, and you find your attention drifting down from the dragon's head to the wood beneath your fingertips. It is oak, strong and patient, shaped with tools that look primitive by modern standards, but somehow managed to create a vessel that can cross entire seas. You imagine the craftsman's axe striking, each swing releasing the smell of fresh sap and wood chips. The sound echoes like a heartbeat in a forest clearing, steady and purposeful. Mainstream history reminds you that Viking longships were usually built from oak planks, overlapped in the clinker style. This wasn't guesswork. It was an engineering choice that made the hull flexible yet tough, able to twist with the sea instead of snapping against it. You run your palm over the smooth grain and notice tar filling the seams. That sticky resin mixed with animal hair makes the ship watertight. You wrinkle your nose. It smells a little like a campfire doused with something funky. Still, it keeps the water out, which is really all that matters when you're 1,000 miles from land. Historians still argue whether the tools Vikings used were more standardized than we give them credit for. Some say each village had its own style of ship, shaped by local traditions, while others think there was a more uniform knowledge, passed along trade routes as surely as iron or amber. Either way, you picture the tools, broad axes, adzes, chisels, glinting in the sun as craftsmen squatted barefoot on logs. Here's your quirky tidbit. Evidence shows that shipbuilders sometimes left deliberate carvings hidden deep inside the planks, never meant to be seen once the vessel was finished. Tiny spirals, runic scratches, even crude drawings of animals. Were these signatures? Secret prayers? Or just bored apprentices doodling when the master turned his back. You smile at the thought of some Viking teenager, centuries ago, carving a little horse or fish inside a beam that would never see the light again. You hear the scrape of rope against wood, the groan of a mast in its socket. These sounds aren't flaws. They're part of the ship's language, the way it speaks when waves nudge its body. You shift, letting your palm rest flat against the plank, and for a moment you swear you can feel a faint pulse. Not magic, just a rhythm of water pressing and flexing. Still, it feels alive, as if the ship itself breathes along with you. You think of the builders who never sailed, men who stood on shore watching their creations vanish into the horizon. Did they feel pride? Worry? Relief that the thing floated at all? Maybe all three. You picture one of them leaning on his axe, nodding quietly as his dragon-headed vessel pulls away. Then he turns back to the forest, ready to fell another tree. The smell of salt, tar, and age-wood blends in the morning air. You stretch your legs, careful not to kick the man snoring beside you. The ship creaks again, steady as a lullaby. Somewhere in the distance, another gull calls out. You take a slow breath, feeling the craftsmanship that surrounds you, the careful cuts, the polished planks, the hidden carvings. The Longship is more than transport. It is a floating cathedral of oak, built not with blueprints, but with memory, skill, and a dash of superstition. You settle deeper against the plank, lulled by the thought that every groove you touch is a bridge between you and someone from 1,000 years ago. Someone with rough hands, sharp eyes, and probably a very sore back. And you realize this ship is not just carrying you across water. It's carrying you across time. Your gaze drifts back to the carved dragon, but this time your mind lingers on the stories behind its form. Dragons weren't just random choices, as if a Viking craftsman woke one morning and thought, you know what would look cool? A lizard with fangs. No, these creatures swam through Norse lore like shadows beneath the waves. You imagine yourself back in a smoky longhouse, a fire crackling, the air thick with mead and roasted meat, as a skald recites tales of beasts that coil and strike in the darkness. Mainstream history tells us the Norse imagined dragons as serpentine monsters, long-bodied, sharp-fanged, eyes glowing with hunger. The most famous might be Jormungandr, the world serpent, so massive it encircled the earth and clamped its tail between its jaws. According to myth, when it finally let go, that would signal the end of days, Ragnarok. You shift uneasily, suddenly aware of the sea's endless horizon. If Jormungandr's out there, you hope he's napping. Historians still argue whether the dragon prows were specifically linked to these myths, or they were more generic symbols of power. Some suggest they were meant to channel the fury of beasts like Fafnir, the cursed dragon slain by the hero Sigurd. Others think they were more practical, borrowing from a wide palette of animal imagery. Dragons, serpents, even wolves, they all carried weight in the Norse imagination. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some sagas, dragons weren't just terrifying. They also hoarded treasure, which might explain why Vikings, renowned for the love of shiny things, felt a kinship. Imagine rowing into a new harbor with a dragon on your ship's nose, silently announcing, "We're here to take your gold, and also we brought our mascot." The dragon's presence isn't just about greed or terror, though. It carries layers of meaning: protection from evil spirits, intimidation of foes, a connection to the divine. You run your hand along the prow, feeling the curves carved into wood, imagining how those lines echo the serpents in ancient stories. Each curl could be a wave, each fong a reminder of chaos lurking beneath calm waters. You think of a child back home in a Viking settlement, hearing stories by lamplight of these beasts, eyes wide as the fire dances across the storyteller's face. Then one day, that same child stands on shore, watching the family's longship slide into the water with a dragon head gleaming. It's not just a boat. It's the stories made real, gliding toward distant horizons. The morning fog curls like smoke around the carved snout. For a fleeting moment, you almost see it exhale, as though the dragon itself is alive, guiding the vessel forward. You exhale too, letting the breath slip from you slowly, matching the rhythm of the sea. Myth and wood, legend and craft. They blur together here, until you're not sure where the story ends and the ship begins. You lean forward, narrowing your eyes at the carved dragon head as the ship noses into the morning mist. Suddenly, you begin to understand its real effect. Not on you, who already feels half asleep, but on anyone unlucky enough to be standing on shore. Imagine it. You're a farmer, minding your own business, stacking hay bales, or maybe argue with a goat that refuses to go inside. You glance at the horizon and see not just a ship, but a dragon sliding silently toward your bay. Your pulse would spike, and you'd probably invent a new kind of sprinting that later generations would call record-breaking. Mainstream history explains that these prow carvings were a form of psychological warfare. The sight of a ship's dragon head looming through fog or cresting waves could frighten defenders before the first axe was even raised. Fear, after all, does half the fighting for you. The Vikings didn't need to be silent assassins. They let their ships announce their arrival with snarling wooden mouths. But historians still argue whether the intimidation factor worked the same way everywhere. Were seasoned warriors really scared of a hunk of carved oak? Or was it mostly effective against villagers and monks who had never seen such things before? Maybe the real power of the dragon was less about its actual look and more about the stories that preceded it. Word of mouth traveled faster than sail sometimes. People had heard whispers of dragon-headed ships, and when they finally saw one, their minds filled in the rest: raids, fire, loss. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars think that bright paint once covered these carvings. Reds, yellows, even blues, like giant floating comic book villains. Over time, the paint would have peeled, leaving the gray we often imagine today. So picture that same farmer, staring at a dragon head painted fire red, sunlight bouncing off the waves. Suddenly, your haystack feels like poor cover. You let yourself relax into the scene, imagining how this carved beast didn't just scare strangers, but also reassured the crew. It told them, you are fearsome, you carry the power of myth, and you're the nightmare in someone else's story. The prow gave courage to men who were tired, cold, and far from home. The ship rocks softly, and you glance back at the crew. One sailor rubs a small charm against the prow, muttering words you can't quite catch. Another spits in the water, as if feeding the sea itself. You wonder if the dragon listens, if its wooden ears store all those whisper hopes and fears. And then, with a faint smile, you remember the monk who wrote in a chronicle about heathen men arriving in ships adorned with the heads of dragons. You imagine his shaking hand, his ink blotting the parchment as he tried to capture that terror. You wonder if he even knew the irony, that centuries later, someone like you would be lying here, lulled into sleep by the very beast he feared. The prow grinned silently, teeth bared, eyes unblinking. Not to scare you now, but to soothe you into a dream where fear loses its edge and becomes just another story told by the sea. The dragon's face glares outward, but as you watch in the swaying light, another thought slips into your mind. Maybe it isn't just about scaring others. Maybe the carving is meant to protect the people on board. You stretch your legs on the rough planks, feeling the longship creak and sigh around you, and wonder if the sailors believe that the dragon wards off the unseen spirits, storms, or whatever else might lurk beyond the horizon. Mainstream history gives you that angle too. Many scholars point out that the Norse world was thick with belief in spirits of sea, sky, and land. Carved figures could serve as guardians, fending off bad luck the same way a charm on a necklace might. You picture sailors whispering prayers into the dragon's wooden ear before setting out, asking it to keep lightning away or to frighten off trolls that might be hiding under waves. Historians still argue whether these carvings were truly religious symbols or simply tradition that evolved into superstition. Some argue the dragon was an apotropaic symbol, a fancy way of saying it keeps the creepy stuff away. Others think that by the time of big raids, the practice was more about cultural pride than literal faith. The truth is hazy, bobbing on the water like driftwood. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some Icelandic law codes, ships were forbidden to sail into certain harbors with their dragon heads attached. The belief was that the carved beast could frighten away the guardian spirits of the land, causing bad harvests or storms. So captains sometimes removed the heads before approaching home. Imagine the ritual. A crew, tired from months at sea, carefully detaching the wooden dragon, as though unclipping the fangs of guard dog, saying softly, "Shoo, not here. You've done your job." The man nearest you snores gently, head leaning against a coil of rope. Another sailor stirs, mutters something in his sleep, and adjusts the fur at his shoulders. The dragon prow doesn't move, but you sense its silent watch. You imagine that if the sea itself tried to rise in fury, the carved beast would bare its teeth and the waves might think twice. The wood under you is damp, the air sharp with salt, but you feel oddly calm. The idea of protection, even carved from oak, wraps around you like a second cloak. Maybe you don't need to fear the endless night, because this guardian is already staring into it for you. You close your eyes, rocking with the rhythm of the ship, and allow yourself to drift. The dragon may be fierce in daylight, but right now, it's just a quiet sentinel at the prow, keeping nightmares at bay, while you sink softly into dreams. The mist thins, and the first pale light of dawn spreads across the sea. You sit up, rubbing the chill from your arms, and there it is, the longship itself gliding forward like a sleek predator. Its lines are elegant, almost impossibly narrow compared to the fat-bellied trading cogs you've glimpsed in drawings of later centuries. The prow and stern curve upward like horns, balanced as though the ship is both bow and arrow, ready to pierce the horizon. Mainstream historians note that Viking longships were marvels of their age. They were shallow-drafted, which meant they could skim not only across deep seas, but also into shallow rivers. That duality, ocean and river, was part of what made Vikings so unpredictable. Imagine being a villager miles inland, never expecting ships to reach you, only see a dragon-headed vessel sliding up your quiet river like a shark in a swimming pool. Historians still argue whether every longship was primarily built for speed or for versatility. Some sagas glorify ships like Ormr Langi, the Long Serpent, a massive warship bristling with oars. Others tell of smaller nars, meant more for carrying goods. Your ship feels somewhere in between, built to slice through waves, but also wide enough to carry men, tools, livestock, and maybe a few barrels of ale. Here's a quirky tidbit. The word longship is a modern catch-all. In their own time, Vikings used specific names depending on size and use. Drekker for dragon ships, Skei for warships, Nar for traders. But all shared the same soul. Light, fast, ready for water like ducks on a pond. You picture the scene from the outside, as if you were standing on a cliff. The sun breaks the horizon, gilding the waves with a pink glow. And there, slipping almost silently, is your longship, its dragon head glinting, its sail billowing gently in the breeze. The rhythm of oars adds a heartbeat to the morning stillness. The crew stirs awake. Someone stretches. Someone yawns loud enough to scare a gull off the railing. Salt stiff hair falls into their faces, but they grin at each other as though dawn itself is a victory. You lean back against the gunwale, letting the sight sink into you. The longship doesn't just move through water. It belongs there, the way a hawk belongs to the sky. And as the dragon shadow stretches ahead across the glittering sea, you realize you're not just on a boat. You're on a symbol of daring, of myth, of a people who trusted wood and wind to carry them into the unknown. You settle deeper into the hull, and soon your ears become more important than your eyes. The sea has its own soundtrack, and right now the leading instrument is the steady beat of oars. Wooden shafts dip into the water almost in unison, each stroke producing a low splash and a rhythmic creak as the handles rub against their sockets. It's not perfect. Someone is always a half-second late, and another huffs in frustration, but the sound still blends into something hypnotic. Mainstream history tells you that a typical longship carried anywhere from 25 to 60 oars, depending on its size. That meant dozens of men working in sequence, each relying on a rhythm to keep balance. The rowing benches were simple planks with little space to shift. You imagine the calluses on hands, the sore backs, the blisters on palms that cracked and bled. Yet the music of the oars carried them through fjords, rivers, and oceans alike. Historians still argue whether drumming or chanting was regularly used to keep time. Some think a drummer sat midship, beating a skin stretched taut, while others point to saga descriptions of songs chanted to the oar strokes. Maybe both happened, depending on the mood. You picture one sailor humming tunelessly until another joins, until the entire row of benches vibrates with sound. Half work song, half lullaby. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some archaeological finds suggest that rowers weren't chained like galley slaves in other cultures. They were free men, farmers, traders, sons of chieftains, who willingly picked up oars when needed, which means they complained freely too. You smile at the thought of a Viking grumbling about blisters the same way you might moan about a dead Wi-Fi connection. The sound rises and falls. Splash, creak, grunt. Splash, creak, grunt. The sea answers with its own rhythm, slapping against the planks. Above it all, the sail occasionally flutters, catching a gust like a sigh. The helmsman adjusts the great steering oar at the stern, his eyes fixed on the dragon head ahead, as though the prow knows the way. You close your eyes and let the sound wash over you. Rowing, rowing, rowing. The men lean forward, pull back, lean forward again. Their breath clouds in the morning air, sinking with the movement until even your lungs feel caught in the same cadence. The noise isn't harsh. It's steady grounding, strangely soothing. Before long, your mind starts to drift. The oars become metronomes, ticking you gently toward sleep. Every splash is another thought dissolving. Every creak another weight lifting. You almost forget you're on a ship at all. You're simply floating in rhythm, carried not just by wood and muscle, but by sound itself. You blink awake to the sight of a man crouched at the prow, his knife flashing the light as he chips at the wood. He isn't hacking wildly, but carving with practiced hand. Each stroke small, precise, almost tender. The dragon head you've been staring at for hours wasn't born perfect. It was shaped like this by men who understood both wood and story. Mainstream history reminds you that ship carvers were respected artisans in Viking communities. They weren't just carpenters. They were part artist, part spiritual guide, trusted to give the vessel its face. Oak and pine were their main canvases, chosen for strength and availability. They used iron chisels and knives, though some tools had bone or antler handles for better grip. You picture their toolkits clattering at their feet, simple but deadly effective. Historians still argue whether every ship received such elaborate attention, or dragon carvings were mostly reserved for larger warships. Some believe smaller boats carried only plain prows, saving time and resources. Others argue that even modest vessels bore some symbolic animal, perhaps not a dragon, but a snake, wolf, or raven. What's certain is that these craftsmen worked quickly. A longship could be built in weeks, and the carving had to keep pace with the hull. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found evidence of trial carvings on scrap planks, little practice dragons whose jaws look lopsided, as if the apprentice sculptor sneezed mid-cut. These may never have seen the water, but they tell you that learning the art was a process, full of mistakes hidden away under piles of wood chips. You chuckle softly, thinking even Vikings had their awkward doodle phase. The man at the prow runs his hand over the dragon's cheek, then rubs in a smear of animal fat mixed with ash. The surface gleams, and the smell is earthy, smoky, not unpleasant. The dragon seems more alive now, its features catching the slanted light. Another sailor joins, sanding a rough edge with a piece of sharkskin. The rasping sound is steady, like someone humming under their breath. You imagine the carver back in his workshop before the voyage. The fire crackling, smoke clinging to his hair, wood chips piled ankle-deep around him. Maybe his children peeked through the doorway, giggling at the monster head their father coaxed out of raw timber. Perhaps his wife scolded him for tracking sawdust into the house. These small domestic echoes cling to the dragon even as it leads men to foreign shores. You lean back, watching as the craftsman finishes his work, wipes the blade on his tunic, and sits down with satisfied sigh. The dragon prow gazes forward, silent but somehow smug, as though pleased to be admired. And you realize that every chip, every groove, every curl carved into that face carries not just artistry, but the human fingerprints of men long gone. Their hands shape what now watches over you. The ship creaks. The waves lap. The dragon gleams faintly. You close your eyes again. Imagine the sound of chisels ringing faintly in your dreams, shaping stories even as you drift. The day grows brighter, and as the ship glides along, you shift your gaze away from the dragon prow and toward the crew. You begin to notice the smaller, quieter details of their lives, things that never make it into the grand sagas. A man sitting cross-legged, stitching up a rip in his wool tunic with thread pulled from his own unraveling sock. Another scraping fish scales off a heron with the tip of his knife, the silver flakes catching in his beard. Life aboard a Viking ship, you realize, is less about glorious battles and more about endless chores. Mainstream history tells us that Viking sailors lived on salted fish, dried meat, and hard bread, foods that could survive weeks at sea without spoiling. They washed it down with ale or watered-down mead, since fresh water was tricky to store long-term without turning foul. You wrinkle your nose as one man chews a mouthful of dried cod, tearing it with his teeth like beef jerky, but salter, tougher, and far less Instagram-worthy. Historians still argue whether crews brought livestock aboard on longer journeys. Some suggest goats or chickens were kept for fresh milk and eggs, while others doubt the practicality of caring for animals on a cramped, rocking deck. You picture it anyway, a bewildered chicken clucking angrily every time an oar splashes too hard. It's a funny thought, though probably less funny if you were the sailor trying to clean up after it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found evidence that Viking sailors carried combs and grooming kits with them. Yes, these weather-beaten warriors paused between rowing ships to comb their hair and beards. You watch as one man, scarred and broad-shouldered, pulls a tiny comb from his pouch and carefully drags it through his tangled locks. For a moment, he looks less like a raider and more like a teenager prepping for prom. Around you, the ship hums with quiet activity. A pair of sailors patch a crack in the hull with tar, while another sharpens his axe. Not for battle just yet, but because dull tools are a nuisance in every century. One man mends a net, tying knots with fingers that move automatically, as though they've done this since childhood. And in the middle of it all, a few younger crewmen joke about who snores loudest. Their laughter blends with the sea breeze, light and fleeting. You close your eyes, picturing what it must feel like to spend weeks here. Your clothes would never quite dry, your hands always raw from rope or oar. You'd wake sore, eat the same salty food, and still have to smile as you rode another 20 miles. And yet, in the rhythm of tasks and the warmth of companionship, you sense a strange contentment. These men don't see chores as interruptions. Chores are life, woven seamlessly into the voyage. The smell of fish, tar, and sweat mingles in the air, pungent but honest. You breathe it in slowly, letting the details wash over you. In this moment, you realize that history isn't just grand stories of kings and gods. It's also mended tunics, patched planks, and combed beards drifting beneath the endless northern sky. You notice the mood shift as the shoreline comes faintly into view. The men sit up straighter, conversation quiets, and a hush falls across the deck. It isn't fear exactly, it's ceremony. You realize you're witnessing something older than the dragon prow, older than the longship itself. The rituals that sailors perform before venturing into the unknown. Mainstream history describes how Norse voyages often began with offerings to the gods or to the spirits of the land and sea. Sacrifices varied. Sometimes a splash of ale poured overboard, sometimes a piece of bread cast into waves, and in more serious cases, even an animal slaughtered on shore before departure. The idea was simple. You don't mess with forces bigger than you without at least saying hello politely. Historians still argue whether these rituals were tightly structured or more improvised. Some sagas suggest chieftains led formal prayers to Odin, Njord, or Thor, calling for safe winds and calm waters. Other accounts hint at smaller, personal charms, each sailor muttering to his own amulet or rune-carved stick tucked into his belt. Maybe both were true, depending on how desperate the voyage felt. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Icelandic saga mentions sailors spitting into the sea as an offering. Not very glamorous, but practical when you don't want to waste food or drink. You grin at the thought of a solemn ritual reduced to a synchronized group spit, followed by a serious nod of approval. The crew around you stirs. One man ties a small pouch to the prow, filled with herbs and a feather, perhaps a charm against storms. Another dips his fingers into a bowl of ale, flicking droplets into the water like blessings. The helmsman, usually gruff, closes his eyes for a moment, lips moving silently. You can't hear the words, but the air feels thicker, charged, as if the sea itself is listening. And then, just as quickly, the moment passes. Someone cracks a joke, another laughs too loud, and the tension breaks like a wave. The ship moves on. the dragon head still glaring at the horizon, its wooden snarl unchanging, but you feel different, calmer, as though some invisible hand has reached down to steady the vessel. You lie back, lulled by the rhythm of waves against wood, comforted by the thought that whether through prayers, charms, or just shared tradition, the crew has asked the universe to watch over you. And maybe, just maybe, it agreed. As the rituals fade into memory, your eyes wander the sides of the ship. Hanging neatly in a row, overlapping like scales, are round shields painted in bright colors. Reds, yellows, blacks, and greens, circles that would bound with iron, each one catching the light differently as the vessel rocks. They rattle against the gunwale when the sea lifts too suddenly, creating a clatter like wind chimes made by warriors. Mainstream history reminds you that these shields weren't only for fighting. They doubled as decoration and protection for the ship itself. Hung along the sides, they made the vessel look more intimidating, widening its profile and shielding rowers from stray arrows. They also serve as quick armor. Grab and go, should a fight break out before you'd even finish your dried fish breakfast. Historians still argue whether the bright paint was symbolic, representing clans, families, or simply personal taste. Some sagas suggest shields bore simple colors or spirals, while others might have been patterned with beasts or runes. Archaeological evidence shows traces of pigment, but whether these were uniform or wildly varied remains a lively debate. You can almost imagine scholars squabbling over paint chips like homeowners arguing in a hardware store. Here's a quirky tidbit. One tale describes a man who painted his shield entirely black, claiming it would absorb the fear of enemies. Another decorated his with glittering metal studs, turning it into a makeshift disco ball under sunlight. Practical? Maybe not. Eye-catching? Definitely. You picture these sailors now, proudly hanging their shields on a rail, comparing designs like kids showing off sneakers. A gust of wind knocks a shield loose, and a young crewman curses softly as he hurries to tie it back. The iron rim clinks against the next shield, setting off a chain of rattles. For a moment, the noise is loud and chaotic, but soon it blends back into the rhythm of the sea, another note in the ship's soundtrack. You run your hand over the nearest shield. It's with rough under your palm, the paint flaking but still bold. You imagine how it must feel to charge into battle with this circle strapped to your arm, terrifying, heavy, but also reassuring, like carrying a piece of home into the fray. And yet, right now there's no battle. Just dawn light flickering across painted circles, bright colors breaking the monotony of wood and sea. You lean back, eyes half closed, listening to the shields clatter softly, like the ship is humming to itself. Another lullaby, born of oak, iron, and paint. The Longship finally noses into calmer waters, and you sense a shift in mood. The men loosen their grips on oars, voices lift, and the dragon prow seems less like a threat and more like a business card. Ahead lies a port on the Baltic, a market buzzing with traders. The smell of smoke and salted fish drifts faintly across the waves. You imagine stepping off the plank into a world not of raids, but of bargains. Mainstream history often forgets that Vikings weren't just raiders, they were traders, too. Baltic markets saw ships arrive stacked with furs, walrus, ivory, amber, and iron. In return, they carried back silk, glass beads, spices, and wine. The Longship wasn't only a weapon, it was a bridge between worlds. You picture sailors unloading sacks of pelts while others argue cheerfully over the price of honey. Historians still argue whether trading was equal in importance to raiding. Some claim commerce was the backbone of Norse wealth, with raids more opportunistic. Others insist the loot from raids outstripped any peaceful barter. The truth, as usual, probably wobbles somewhere in between. A crew that raided one coast might sell stolen goods the next week at market, keeping a straight face as though it all came from Grandma's attic. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeological digs at trading centers like Hedeby and Burka have uncovered thousands of glass beads, bright blues, greens, and reds, suggesting that Viking traders had a soft spot for shiny trinkets. Some beads even came from as far as the Middle East. You grin, imagining a rough-bearded warrior haggling fiercely, not for a sword, but for a necklace to bring home. The market hums around you. A man shouts about salt fish. Another waves a strip of dyed cloth. Children dart between stalls, giggling. The Longship rocks gently at the dock, its dragon head glaring at all who pass. But here's less terrifying and more like a brand logo, instantly recognizable, announcing, "These are the Norsemen. They mean business." You trail behind the crew as they carry crates onto shore, voices raised in half-friendly, half-suspicious tones. A merchant with a thick beard and brighter clothes than the Vikings ever wore claps one of them on the shoulder, laughing as though they've known each other for years. Trade is half goods, half trust, or at least a performance of trust. The sun rises higher. The market grows louder, but you find yourself drifting. The clatter of coins, the creak of wagons, the murmur of bargaining. It all folds into a drowsy background hum. The dragon waits at the prow, unblinking, while you sit on the edge of the dock, eyes half closed, soothed by the strange mix of commerce and sea spray. The markets fade behind you as the longship cuts back into open water. The chatter of traders is replaced by the whistle of wind and the steady push of oars. But your mind lingers on stories whispered along the Baltic, tales carried farther than goods ever could. You hear them now in low voices among the crew, the monks, the monasteries, the frightened bells. Mainstream history notes that some of the earliest and most famous Viking raids targeted monasteries, particularly the raid on Lindisfarne in 793. Monks were easy targets, wealthy, unarmed, and often isolated along coasts or riverbanks. Imagine the scene: quiet prayer, the smell of parchment and candle wax, shattered by the sudden roar of men, and the shadow of a dragon-headed prow looming outside. Historians still argue why monasteries were singled out so often. Was it because they held silver, books, and cattle? Or was it symbolic? A strike against Christianity by men who still clung to Odin and Thor? Maybe it was just practical. Monasteries were soft fruit hanging low, easy to pluck. Whatever the reason, the story spread quickly, fueling the terror associated with dragon-proud ships. Here's a quirky tidbit. One account claims monks sometimes try to hide their treasures in wells or bury them hastily in churchyards when raiders were sighted. Centuries later, archaeologists have indeed found coins and chalices buried in odd places, as though stashed by trembling hands that never returned to reclaim them. You picture it. Frantic digging while the sound of oars grew louder, the dragon head cutting closer through the fog. The crew around you laughs darkly as one man recounts a tale of a raid. He makes it sound almost like a boast, but his grin is tired, and you sense he's telling it as much to pass the time as to glorify violence. You lean back, the image of the carved dragon fresh in your mind. To the Vikings, it was a talisman. To the monks, it was a nightmare. The ship sways, and you close your eyes. Bells ring faintly in your imagination, not an alarm, but as echoes drifting across time. You aren't there to fight, only to listen. The dragon's mouth yawns wide, but for you, it opens not to terror but to a slow, heavy quiet that wraps you like a cloak. The sea is calm tonight, and with it comes a softer rhythm among the men. No one shouts, no one argues. Instead, you catch the low hum of a voice rising from the center of the ship. A skald, the poet, the memory keeper, clears his throat and begins to sing. His words roll like waves, slow and deliberate, carrying stories older than the men rowing beside you. Mainstream history tells us that skalds were more than entertainers. They were historians, weaving sagas of kings, heroes, and voyages. Without them, much of Viking lore would have vanished like foam on the tide. Their verses were carefully structured, filled with kennings, poetic metaphors like calling the sea whale road or a sword battle flame. You listen now as the skald's song transforms a longship into a stage, every or stroke a drumbeat to his tale. Historians still argue how much of what skalds sang was invention versus memory. Were they faithful reporters of real events, or creative artists adding flair to impress chieftains? The truth likely lies between. You smile, imagining a poet exaggerating how many enemies were slain, while his friends and crew roll their eyes, whispering, "It was 3, not 30. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sagas mention skalds who insulted people with sharp verses, kind of like Viking stand-up comedians. One wrong word, though, and the joke might earn you a duel instead of a laugh. You picture this poet balancing carefully, telling stories vivid enough to entertain, but cautious enough not to offend the man with the biggest axe. The song tonight is gentler, He sings of a voyage blessed by Njord, god of the sea, and of a dragon-headed ship slipping through moonlit waters. The crew join softly on the chorus, their rough voices blending into a low drone, almost a chant. The sound washes over you, thick and steady, making your eyelids heavy. The firelight flickers against faces. Scars softened by shadow, eyes close as men mouth words they learned long ago. The skald leans back, satisfied, his voice trailing into silence. For a moment, the only sound is the creak of wood and the hush of waves. Then a chuckle breaks the quiet, a joke about how the poet left out the licensed sore backs. Laughter ripples, but gently, like water tapping the hull. You sink deeper into the lull. The song lingers in your head, its rhythm echoing with the oars, its imagery blurring with the dragon's silhouette. Stories in sea, poetry in sleep, they merge until you can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. The singing drifts away, and in its place, the crew begins to stir with a new purpose. A sailor digs into a pouch and pulls out a small, translucent stone. He holds it up to the sky, squinting through it, turning it this way and that. You lean closer, curious. It's not just a shiny rock. It's a tool, one that may have guided Vikings farther than their enemies ever expected. Mainstream history points to the so-called sunstone, possibly Iceland spar, a crystal that can polarize light. On cloudy days, or even at twilight, it could help sailors find the sun's position by revealing the direction of polarized rays. You picture men scanning the horizon with crystals in hand, turning them like compasses made from frozen light. If true, this little trick would have been a quiet revolution in navigation. Historians still argue whether Vikings truly used sunstones, or the references in sagas were later embellishments. Some dismiss the idea as legend, while others note experiments showing the stones actually work, even in heavy fog. Maybe the truth lies in between. Not every ship carried them, but some clever navigator tucked one away, using it when the sky refused to cooperate. Here's a quirky tidbit. One saga claims a Viking named Sigurd used a solar stone to locate the hidden sun on a snowy day. Picture him holding up the crystal, muttering, "Aha! There you are," while the rest of the crew looked on, rolling their eyes, convinced it was wizardry. In a world without GPS, any edge was worth keeping, even if it seemed like magic. The sailor on your ship lowers the crystal, nodding as though satisfied. He tucks it back into the pouch with a grin. Around him, the crew adjusts sails and ropes, trusting his invisible reading. You close your eyes and imagine what it feels like to follow not just stars, but sunbeams, even when the sun hides. The sea stretches endlessly in every direction. Yet here you are, somehow still on course. The waves whisper against the hull. The dragon prow points steadily ahead. And you feel an odd comfort knowing that navigation isn't always about certainty. Sometimes it's about faith, in tools and stories, in the quiet glow of a stone that catches what the naked eye cannot. You exhale, letting that faith sink into you, steadying your thoughts like a hand on your shoulder. The day wears on, and soon you find yourself approaching the bustle of a Scandinavian harbor. It's not the quiet, sacred hush of rituals or the eerie presence of dragon heads cutting through fog. Here, the air is alive with noise, as though the land itself is excited to greet the ships. You hear hammering shouts and the calls of gulls circling overhead, eager for scraps. Mainstream history describes Viking harbors as busy hubs where longships pulled in alongside merchant vessels, fishing boats, and coastal traders. Places like Hedeby or Kapang weren't just ports. They were melting pots, where foreign goods, ideas, and even gossip mingled. Imagine dozens of carved prows lined up together, dragon heads glaring at one another like a wooden staring contest. Historians still argue about the exact size and organization of these harbors. Were they carefully managed, with designated docks and warehouses? Or were they more chaotic, with boats pulled ashore wherever there was space? Archaeological digs suggest both order and improvisation. Rows of piers alongside evidence of impromptu repairs done in the mud. You can almost hear the arguments between sailors shouting, "That's my spot." Here's a quirky tidbit. Some harbors held markets so lively that laws were passed forbidding fights while trading was underway. Apparently, Even Vikings needed reminders not to throw axes at each other in the middle of a bargain. You chuckle, picturing a burly trader grumbling, but setting his axe down politely before haggling over a jar of honey. The harbor before you smells of tar, smoked fish, and wet rope. Shipwrights bend over new hulls, tapping planks into place, their children running barefoot nearby. Women carry baskets of bread and cheese, selling them to weary sailors. A group of men hoist a barrel off a ship, sloshing liquid inside, ale or wine, destined for some long-house feast. The entire place thrums like a beehive, each person moving with purpose, each sound blending into a soothing din. Your longship glides into place among its kin. The dragon head at the prow seems less threatening here, one fierce face among many. But still, it holds your eye. Carved with gleaming with oil, it stands like a badge of identity, marking your crew as part of this vast seafaring family. You close your eyes, letting the harbor wash over you. The hammering becomes a heartbeat, the shouts a lullaby, the smell of smoke a blanket tugged over your senses. Amid all this noise, you find calm, proof that sometimes, even in chaos, there is comfort. The harbor fades behind you as the longship slips once again into open water, and your thoughts turn to creatures carved into its prow. Why dragons? Why serpents? Why birds and beasts at all? You realize these animals weren't chosen at random. They carried meanings, layered and heavy, like runes etched into wood. Mainstream history tells us that Norse culture thrived on symbolism. Animals stood as bridges between the natural world and the spiritual. Dragons and serpents embodied chaos and danger, but also strength and guardianship. Ravens were Odin's messengers, circling the battlefield and whispering secrets into the god's ears. Wolves evoked Fenrir, the monstrous beast fated to devour the sun. Yet they also stood for ferocity and loyalty. Each carving was not just decoration, but story in miniature, staring down the sea. Historians still argue whether ship symbols were chosen for a personal clan or purely practical reasons. Did a family line claim the raven as their totem, painting or carving it into every vessel? Or did carvers simply pick whatever seemed most fitting for the voyage? The lack of clear records leaves the question drifting, like so many unanswered or strokes. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sagas mention ships with names tied to their animal prows, like ORM the serpent or Wrath the raven. It's as though the ship itself became alive, its identity inseparable from the beast carved on its nose. You smile, thinking of sailors referring to their vessel as though it were a stubborn friend. The raven doesn't like this wind today. Or, the serpent is hungry for speed. The crew around you seems to share in this belief. A man pats the dragon head before taking his turn at the oars, muttering something like a greeting. Another jokes that the raven carved on his brother's ship back home brings bad luck, always flying crooked. They laugh, but the laughter has an edge of nervous respect, as if mocking the symbols too openly might tempt fate. You lean against the side of the ship, feeling the sway. Above you, gulls circle lazily, their wings catching the light in flashes. You imagine them as echoes of Hugin and Munin, Odin's thought and memory, watching from above. The dragon at the prow stares forward, its wooden teeth gleaming, carrying centuries of belief in its gaze. You exhale slowly. The sea is vast, but these symbols shrink its dangers into stories you can carry. A dragon doesn't eliminate storms, but it makes you feel braver as you face them. A raven doesn't still the waves, but it gives you a sense of guidance, as though invisible wings beat just beyond your sight. And in that quiet, you find comfort, not in certainty, but in meaning. The sea stretches out endlessly, but your attention shifts now to something less physical than dragons or oars, the laws and customs that tied Viking society together. You realize that longships weren't just vehicles. They were also symbols carried into meetings called things, great assemblies where free men gathered to debate, decide, and argue until someone finally shouted loud enough to end it. Mainstream history explains that the thing was a cornerstone of Norse governance. These were open-air assemblies held on hills or near sacred sites, where disputes were settled, laws recited, and leaders chosen. And ships, especially those with fierce prows, could serve as markers of identity. A man's vessel was proof of his standing, how many warriors he could bring, how much wealth he controlled. In a world without business cards, a dragon-headed longship, was about as impressive as it got. Historians still argue about how democratic these assemblies truly were. Some insist that free men all had a voice, while others suggest the wealthiest chieftains dominated the proceedings. It's a debate that stretches across centuries. Was a Viking thing a beacon of early democracy, or just another stage for the powerful? The truth probably floated somewhere in between, like a ship caught between tides. Here's a quirky tidbit. At some assemblies, disputes were settled not with swords, but with insults, formal, structured verses meant to humiliate your opponent in rhyme. Imagine standing before a crowd, your dignity resting on your ability to come up with a Viking version of a roast battle. Fail too badly, and you lose not only the case but your reputation as well. You picture yourself sitting among the crowd at a thing, listening as men in cloaks argue about land, livestock, and honor. Behind them, dragon-headed ships line the shore, each one glaring like a witness. The prows seem to watch, silent judges carved from oak, reminding everyone that decisions made here carry weight far beyond the meadow. Back on the Longship, you lean against the railing, eyes half closed. The idea of law might feel abstract, but for these sailors, it was as real as the sea spray hitting their faces. The prow wasn't just a decoration. It was a banner of belonging, proof that they had a place in the world's arguments. The waves lapped gently, and you let your mind drift with them. The murmur of debate, the laughter after insults, the carved heads glaring from the shore, it all blends into a steady hum, like voices fading into dream. The waves hush you into a softer mood, and your thoughts turn from laws and laughter to something more solemn. You picture a ship like this one, not alive with chatter and chores, but still sacred and heavy with meaning. A burial ship, carved and prepared to carry a leader into the afterlife. Mainstream history confirms that high-ranking Vikings were sometimes laid to rest in ships, either buried in the earth under great mounds or set ablaze to drift across water. The vessel became a coffin and a chariot in one, its dragon head guiding the soul on its last voyage. Archaeological finds, like the Oseberg ship in Norway, show how elaborate these burials could be, filled with weapons, jewelry, carts, and even sacrificed animals. Historians still argue whether the fiery ship burning at sea was a common practice or more a mythic image preserved in sagas. Physical evidence leans more towards ship burials under mounds, where the vessel was entombed in soil. But the burning image is powerful, a flickering symbol that has sailed through centuries of poetry and film. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the Oseberg burial, archaeologists found not just weapons but also everyday items, beds, buckets, textiles, even a sleigh. It's as though the departed might wake up groggy in the afterlife and immediately need to grab a bucket or hop on a sled. The thought makes you smile, death but still practical. On your longship, you glance again at the dragon prow and imagine it leading not warriors but spirits into mist. The head, once a symbol of intimidation, becomes a guardian guiding someone gently across the threshold. The crew around you fades in your vision, replaced by mourners standing on shore, their torches casting light across water. They whisper prayers, shed quiet tears, and then step back as the vessel drifts away. The sea rocks you gently, like a cradle. You feel the weight of those rituals, the honor, the love, the belief that a ship was more than wood and nails. It was passage, memory, and hope stitched together by faith. You exhale slowly, and the dragon's gaze softens in your mind, less fierce, more compassionate. You close your eyes. For a moment, you're not just a passenger. You're part of that ancient send-off, drifting calmly between worlds, wrapped in the silence of eternity and the sound of waves. The memory of burials lingers like smoke, but soon the horizon shifts again. You imagine the Longship gliding not toward empty coasts or misty islands, but toward Constantinople, the shining jewel of Byzantium. The dragon prow points its nose at a city of domes and mosaics, where marble walls gleam under a sun hotter than anything the North usually offers. Mainstream history tells us that Vikings, known in the East as the Rus, made their way along rivers and seas to reach Constantinople. Some came as traders, some as raiders, and many as mercenaries, hired into the famed Varangian Guard. Imagine the scene. Ships bristling with dragon heads, sliding up to the Golden Horn, astonishing citizens used to sleeker Mediterranean vessels. It must have felt like watching wolves enter a garden. Historians still argue about the exact nature of this relationship. Were the Norse mostly feared barbarians at the city's gates, or respected allies valued for their loyalty in battle? Some sources praise their discipline, while others describe them as fierce and uncontrollable. The debate drifts unlike the ships themselves, caught between admiration and suspicion. Here's a quirky tidbit. Accounts claim that Varangian guards carried axes so massive they shocked the locals. These men, once farmers or traders in the north, now march through Byzantine palaces with weapons taller than some courtiers. You grin at the thought of delicate nobles whispering nervously, while a 6-foot blonde giant leaned casually on an axe that could probably split the dinner table in two. Back on your imagined deck, you feel the heat prick your skin. The crew shades their eyes, gawking at the city scale, its towering walls, its churches glittering with gold leaf, its markets spilling over with spices that smell of cinnamon and pepper. The dragon prow seems oddly at home, snarling confidently as though daring the city to blink first. The oars dip lazily now, less a rhythm, more glide. Traders along the harbor stare, children point, and somewhere a merchant mutters a prayer. To the Byzantines, these ships are both fascinating and frightening, emissaries of a world colder, rougher, and strangely magnetic. You close your eyes, picturing the clash of cultures. Norsemen with salt still crusting their beards, walking beside perfumed courtiers in silk robes. The dragon ship bobbing at anchor, its carved snout glaring at marble docks. And you, resting between them, lulled not by battle or bargaining, but by the strange comfort of knowing that even here, at the edge of empires, the sea still rocks you gently to sleep. The dragon prow gleams faintly as your attention shifts from the bustling harbors of Byzantium back to the bones of the ship itself. You lean close, tracing the overlapping planks of oak that form the hull. They lie like scales on a fish, each one nailed and tarred into place with precision. You realize you're seeing the secret of Viking mastery, hidden not in myth, but in joinery. Mainstream history calls this clinker-built construction. Instead of butting planks edge to edge, shipwrights overlapped them, fastening each with iron rivets. The result was a hull that flexed with the sea, bending instead of breaking under pressure. This technique made Viking ships lighter, faster, and more durable than many of their rivals. Without it, raids and voyages across oceans might have been impossible. Historians still argue whether this method spread from Scandinavia outward, or if it was adapted from earlier traditions along the North Sea. Some evidence suggests Anglo-Saxon ships used similar techniques, raising questions of who influenced whom. Did Vikings perfect it or borrow and improve? The debate creaks back and forth like timbers in a swell. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some wrecks, archaeologists found traces of animal hair mixed with tar, used to seal gaps between planks. Picture a Viking shipbuilder kneeling in the mud, stuffing sheep's wool into seams while muttering about leaks, probably with the same frustration you'd have changing a flat tire in the rain. Practical, messy, and surprisingly effective. The sounds around you blend into a carpenter's symphony. The echo of axes, the rasp of files, the low murmur of men debating the best way to set a plank. You imagine the shipyard where this dragon ship was born, the smell of sap and smoke hanging thick in the air, children chasing each other through piles of wood chips, women bringing food to workers, hammers ringing like bells announcing the birth of a vessel destined for faraway shores. On the water now, you feel the effect of all that craftsmanship. The hull rises easily with each wave, light enough that oars alone can send it skimming, strong enough to bear the weight of men, shields, and stories. The dragon prow isn't just decoration. It's the crown of top engineering genius. You rest your hand on the planks, warm from the sun, slick with spray. They creak, but it's a reassuring sound, like floorboards in a familiar house. You close your eyes, letting the flex and give the hull rock you into calm. The ship breathes with you, a living creature of oak and iron, carrying you farther into history with every gentle sigh. The dragon prow gleams faintly as your attention shifts from the bustling harbors of Byzantium back to the bones of the ship itself. You lean close, tracing the overlapping planks of oak that form the hull. They lie like scales on a fish, each one nailed and tarred into place with precision. You realize you're seeing the secret of Viking mastery, hidden not in myth but in joinery. Mainstream history calls this clinker-built construction. Instead of butting planks edge to edge, Shipwrights overlapped them, fastening each with iron rivets. The result was a hull that flexed with the sea, bending instead of breaking under pressure. This technique made Viking ships lighter, faster, and more durable than many of their rivals. Without it, raids and voyages across oceans might have been impossible. Historians still argue whether this method spread from Scandinavia outward or if it was adapted from earlier traditions along the North Sea. Some evidence suggests Anglo-Saxon ships used similar techniques, raising questions of who influenced whom. Did Vikings perfect it or borrow and improve? The debate creaks back and forth like timbers in a swell. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some wrecks, archaeologists found traces of animal hair mixed with tar, used to seal gaps between planks. Picture a Viking shipbuilder kneeling in the mud, stuffing sheep's wool into seams while muttering about leaks, probably with the same frustration you'd have changing a flat tire in the rain. Practical, messy, and surprisingly effective. The sounds around you blend into a carpenter's symphony. The echo of axes, the rasp of files, the low murmur of men debating the best way to set a plank. You imagine the shipyard where this dragon ship was born, the smell of sap and smoke hanging thick in the air. Children chasing each other through piles of wood chips, women bringing food to workers, hammers ringing like bells announcing the birth of a vessel destined for faraway shores. On the water now, you feel the effect of all that craftsmanship. The hull rises easily with each wave, light enough that oars alone can send it skimming, strong enough to bear the weight of men, shields, and stories. The dragon prow isn't just decoration. It's the crown of top engineering genius. You rest your hand on the planks, warm from the sun, slick with spray. They creak, but it's a reassuring sound, like floorboards in a familiar house. You close your eyes, letting the flex and give the hull rock you into calm. The ship breathes with you, a living creature of oak and iron, carrying you farther into history with every gentle sigh. The ship sways gently, and you turn your gaze toward the shorelines passing in the distance. Villages, the coasts, smoke rising lazily from turf-roof homes. On those shores, women stand at looms, weaving cloth as steady as waves, their hands moving with practiced grace. While the men ride dragon-headed ships into sea foam and sagas, the women shape the fabric of life that waits at home. Mainstream history acknowledges the vital role of Viking women in domestic and economic life. They managed farms, households, and weaving halls while men were away. Their woven wool wasn't just clothing. It was currency, trade good, and sailcloth. Without it, the longships you drift upon would never catch wind. The dragon prow may look fierce, but rides on canvas stretched from hours of careful weaving by unseen hands. Historians still argue about the full extent of women's influence. Some sagas show them as background figures, tending to hearths. Others describe women advising chieftains, even pushing them toward raids or peace. The debate continues. Were Viking women primarily homemakers or hidden power brokers steering families and voyages from behind? Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found small figurines of women holding swords or drinking horns, suggesting that women sometimes joined feasts, rituals, and possibly even battles. While rare, these hints blur the neat lines between warrior and homemaker. You smile, imagining a woman at her loom muttering, "If you lot can't manage this voyage, I'll row the dragon-headed thing myself." On the deck around you, a few sailors carve runes into bits of driftwood, murmuring about wives, mothers, and sisters back home. One laughs about a promised feast waiting if he returns. Another grows quiet, eyes fixed on a horizon, as though imagining the familiar smoke of his village hearth. You feel the weight of absence here, the sense that every oar stroke is tethered to a waiting voice, a patient song on land. You lean back, rocking with the ship, and hear in your mind the rhythm of a loom. The shuttles thump, the threads pulling tight. The sound blends with the creak of timbers and the splash of waves, until weaving and rowing feel like the same act, both steady, both endless, both binding lives together across the sea. The dragon head stares forward, but behind its fierce grin lies a memory of home, of women weaving sails that carry ships, weaving stories that outlast raids, weaving a fabric strong enough to tether the wild sea to something soft, steady, and human. The longship rocks quietly, and laughter breaks the monotony. A story is being told midship, not about God or dragons, but about punishments, peculiar ones reserved for those who didn't follow shipboard rules. You lean in curious, because it turns out Viking justice could be both harsh and oddly comical. Mainstream history records that discipline on a long voyage was essential. A ship's survival depended on teamwork, and slacking or cheating could endanger everyone. Fines were common, measured in silver or in kind. Spill ale? Pay back in ale. Break an oar? Replace it. Fail to do your share? Expect ridicule and maybe worse. The Longship was less a democracy here and more a floating family, where chores weren't optional. Historians still argue about how formal these punishments were. Some claim rules were set by the ship's leader, enforced with strict authority. Others suggest discipline was more communal, with the crew mocking or shaming offenders until they complied. Either way, oar was kept not only by fear of storms, but also by fear of becoming the butt of jokes. Here's a quirky tidbit. One saga mentions a man punished not with lashes or exile, but with the humiliating duty of sitting on the ale bench and serving drinks to everyone else for days. Another tale tells of fines being paid in butter. Yes, butter. Imagine trudging home after a voyage, grumbling, "There goes my winter spread because I dropped the stew." On your ship, a sailor recounts how a clumsy crewmate once spilled precious tar and was forced to sit at the prow, silent, with a chicken tied around his neck for an entire day. You laugh softly, though you can't tell if it's true or just exaggerated for entertainment. The others roar with amusement, nudging each other, clearly enjoying the retelling more than the actual memory. The dragon head at the prow looms silently, its snarl oddly fitting as a reminder. Behave, or the beast will judge you. You can almost imagine it rolling its wooden eyes at the foolishness of men. You lean back, eyelids heavy, soothed by the mixture of laughter and discipline. Even punishments, it seems, become part of the rhythm of life at sea. Rules weren't just about fear. They were about keeping the fragile balance that let dozens of men live, row, eat, and sleep on a wooden sliver of hope cutting through endless water. The laughter fades into chuckles, then into quiet murmurs, and finally into the steady creak of timbers. You exhale, comforted by the idea that even chaos at sea had boundaries, and even mistakes could end not in despair, but in butter. The laughter dies down, and soon the crew grows quieter again. One sailor reaches into a pouch and draws out a small hammer pendant, silver glinting in the light. He rubs it between his fingers, whispering words too soft for you to catch. It's a reminder that no matter how practical a ship feels, no voyage is ever truly separate from the gods. Mainstream history tells us that Vikings called upon Thor and Jord and even Odin before and during their journeys. Thor, with his mighty hammer, protected against storms and lightning. Jord, god of the sea and wealth, was invoked for calm waters and prosperous trade. Odin, less predictable, was sought for wisdom and victory, though his gifts often came at a cost. You picture the sailors murmuring prayers, not as elaborate ceremonies, but as small personal exchanges, tokens tossed into the waves, charms tied to ropes. Historians still argue about how deeply religious these rituals were. Some claim seafaring prayers were as routine as tying a knot, more habit than belief. Others insist they were sincere acts of faith, woven into the fabric of every voyage. Perhaps both are true, some men praying earnestly, others doing it just in case. After all, when you're surrounded by endless water, superstition feels less like a luxury and more like insurance. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found Thor's hammer amulets carved not only in silver, but also in bone and wood, suggesting sailors made their own charms if they couldn't afford the fancy ones. You smile, imagining a rough carpenter carving a crooked little hammer and muttering, "Good enough, Thor won't mind." Around you, the crew murmurs different invocations. One man kisses a raven feather tucked in his belt for Odin. Another pours a splash of ale into the sea, hoping Jord will notice. A younger sailor nervously grips the hammer pendant, squeezing it like a lifeline. The dragon prow looms ahead, but even it feels like an offering, its snarling mouth a prayer carved into oak. The air smells faintly of smoke and salt, as if the sea itself has leaned closer to listen. For a moment, silence reigns, broken only by the waves. You breathe slowly, sensing the mix of reverence and weariness in the men around you. Belief doesn't erase hardship, but it makes the water feel less lonely. You lean back, letting the thought carry you. Whether by God, by dragon, or by sheer stubbornness, these sailors never face the sea alone. And neither right now, do you? The day brightens, but the sea begins to shift. At first, it's a gentle swell, the kind that rocks you like a cradle. Then the wind sharpens, the waves rise, and the longship groans as though it suddenly remembers it's made of wood. Ropes strain, sails flap violently, and the men scramble to their benches. You hold your breath, watching the storm gather. Mainstream history tells us that Viking sailors were no strangers to tempests. Their ships, light and flexible, could ride waves that would shatter heavier vessels. But survival demanded skill. Oars had to be shipped quickly, sails reefed in time, and the great steering oar at the stern held firm by a helmsman with nerves of iron. Without discipline, even the finest dragon-headed ship could be swallowed whole. Historians still argue how far Vikings ventured into truly open oceans versus hugging coasts. Some believe storms were their greatest limiters, forcing them to stay within sight of land. Others point to evidence of voyages all the way to Greenland and beyond, proving they braved the full fury of the North Atlantic. The truth probably lies in both extremes. Some stayed cautious, others dared, and luck decided who lived to tell it. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sagas describe sailors tying themselves to the mast or even to each other during storms, a rough-and-ready safety measure. Imagine a crew lashed together, sliding across wet planks, grunting. At least if we drown, we'll drown as one big tangle. You almost laugh, though the ship beneath you heaves too sharply to feel relaxed. The wind slaps your face, cold and wet. Salt stings your lips, and spray drenches your hair. The men pull ropes with desperate strength, muscles straining. Curses lost in the gale. The dragon prow, slick with rain, stares ahead, fangs bared as though challenging the storm itself. You close your eyes, breathing slowly. Beneath the chaos, the ship flexes but does not break. The planks bend. The tar holds. The oars are pulled in safely. The dragon leads you forward, cutting into waves like a knife through cloth. Around you, men cling, pant, and pray, but still they row, still they endure. The storm roars, but to your ears it becomes a lullaby of power. The crash of waves, the groan of wood, the thunder rolling overhead, all blend into a fierce symphony that somehow soothes. You let the sounds wash over you, like heavy rain tapping on a rooftop while you lie safe inside. For all its fury, the storm cannot erase the calm inside you. You are afloat, protected by wood, by skill, by stubborn faith, and by a dragon that refuses to bow. The sea calms at last, though the memory of the storm lingers in your bones. The men slump back onto the benches, exhausted but alive. You glance once more to dragon prow, its wooden snarl now glistening with dried salt. Yet something new dawns on you. Not every dragon carving was unique to the Vikings. Across the coasts and rivers they touched, other peoples began to mimic the fierce heads. Mainstream history shows that dragon-prowed vessels weren't limited to Scandinavia. The Rus along the rivers of Eastern Europe built their own ships with similar designs, blending Norse craftsmanship with Slavic traditions. Celtic tribes in the British Isles painted and carved animal motifs on their boats. Even Saxons, once terrified of these prows, began adopting fierce figureheads, as though by copying their enemies they could borrow a bit of their power. Historians still argue whether these imitations were acts of admiration, intimidation, or simple practicality. Was it fashion, like everyone suddenly wanted the same trendy sneaker? Or was it psychological warfare, making it harder for distant villagers to tell friend from foe? The debate ripples like tide water, never fully still. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that even Mediterranean galleys occasionally sported carved animal heads, lions, boars, or eagles, long after Norse raids had ended. It's as if the idea of putting a scary mascot on the front of your boat proved just too good to pass up. You imagine a sailor rolling his eyes, saying, "Great, now everyone is a dragon. What's next, matching sails?" You rest against the hull, watching the play of light across the water. It strikes you that imitation is its own form of flattery and survival. The Vikings carved dragons to project fear and strength. Their rivals, borrowing the same style, turn it into a language of the sea. Suddenly, coasts weren't just lined with plain ships. They bristled with beasts, each prow glaring into horizon like a floating menagerie. The longship rocks gently. A sailor scratches at his beard, muttering about a Saxon ship he once saw with a dragon head so ugly it frightened its own crew. The men laugh, their voices lighter now that the storm has passed. You smile, lulled by the idea that even in competition, cultures share, copy, and reshape what once terrified them. The dragon at your prow, salt-streaked and steady, stares ahead. Imitated or not, it remains the original, an oak-born face of sea, carrying you deeper into its story. The horizon dims as the season shifts, and your thoughts wander away from storms and rival ships to the places these sailors return to after months at sea. Imagine a small village nestled by a fjord, snow piling against turf-roofed houses, smoke curling from low chimneys. Winter presses hard here, but inside those homes, warmth glows from fire and company. Mainstream history reminds you that Viking winters were long, dark, and brutally cold. Men who had spent months rowing and raiding now spent months waiting out the snow, repairing tools, tending animals, and telling stories. It was a rhythm of extremes. Fury at sea, patience on land. Winter villages were quiet but alive, sustained by food stored in pits and dried goods stockpiled during summer. Historians still argue how much leisure time winter truly offered. Some accounts suggest it was a season of relative rest, with feasting and storytelling taking center stage. Others argue that survival work never really paused. Livestock needed constant care, houses demanded repair, and resources were always tight. Perhaps both are true. Moment of laughter around a fire wedged between chores and freezing wind. Here's a quirky tidbit. Evidence shows Vikings used skis and ice skates made from animal bones to get around during snowy months. Imagine trudging out to check your sheep, strapping bone skates onto your boots, and gliding clumsily across frozen ground. You chuckle at the picture. Warriors who once terrified Europe, reduced to wobbling across ice like kids at a rink. You breathe an imagined smell of those winter halls. Smoke, stew, what will drying by the fire. Women weave by lamplight. Children play games with carved bones, and elders recount tales of gods and voyages. Somewhere, a skald sings softly of dragon-headed ships braving distant waters, his voice mixing with a crackle of firewood. The men on your longship lean back, reminiscing about home. One hums a lullaby his mother used to sing. Another mutters about stew thick enough to stand a spoon in. Their words drift into the cold night air, and you feel them settle in your chest, comforting as fur blankets. The dragon prow ahead glares as fiercely as ever, but in your half-dreaming mind it begins to soften. You see it not as a symbol of fear, but as a reminder of return. No matter how far the ship sails, it always carries its crew back to hearth, smoke, and the laughter of winter villages. The snowbound villages fade in your mind, replaced by the glint of something unusual. You imagine walking along a frozen river, hearing the scrape of bone against ice. A group of Viking children skates past, laughing, their feet strapped into curved blades carved from animal shin bones. Their fathers watch, leaning on oars repurposed as walking sticks, and you realize Vikings didn't only innovate on water. They tinker with clever inventions on land, too. Mainstream history tells us that the Norse used skis and ice skates centuries before many other Europeans adopted them. Bone skates allowed quick travel across frozen rivers, while skis, simple planks of wood with leather straps, made winter hunting possible. These inventions weren't luxuries. They were survival tools, giving Norse people mobility in landscapes that could otherwise trap them. Historians still argue about how widely these tools were used. Were bone skates mostly toys for children, or did adults rely on them to cross icy terrain? Did skis play a central role in hunting, or were they occasional aids? The archaeological finds, bones worn smooth on their undersides, wooden skis with leather bindings, suggest both fun and necessity. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sagas describe legendary skiers, such as Uller, a god associated with skiing, hunting, and archery. Imagine a divine figure zooming down a snowy slope, bow in hand, the world's first extreme sports champion. You grin at the thought of a Viking carving runes into his skis, bragging about his speed the way someone today might brag about their marathon time. Back on the ship, the men laugh about winter inventions too. One sailor mimics, stumbling on skates, arms flailing dramatically, sending the others into chuckles. Another boasts that his village once raced across frozen lakes on skis, betting bread and meat on the winners. The dragon prow, steady and solemn, seems an odd contrast to these playful stories, yet even it feels softened by the humor. You close your eyes, letting the images blur together. Children skimming across ice on bone skates, hunters gliding silently through snowy woods, laughter echoing across frozen fjords. These forgotten inventions remind you that Norse life wasn't only raids and storms. It was also ingenuity, play, and the small, clever ways people made a hard world livable. The longship rocks gently, and you drift with it, comforted by the thought that even in harsh winters, humans always find ways to glide, laugh, and move forward. On sea, on snow, and into history. The laughter about winter games drifts away, replaced by a softer kind of amusement. You notice how the crew teases one another, trading quips that bite but don't wound. Humor, it seems, has its place even on a dragon-headed ship, and it isn't always noble or sophisticated. In fact, it's often downright ridiculous. Mainstream history acknowledges that Viking sagas contain plenty of humor, much of it sharp and sarcastic. Warriors mocked each other for cowardice, laziness, or even having too much pride. These jokes weren't just for fun. They acted as social glue, a way to keep egos in check and pass the time on endless voyages. You hear echoes of those same voices now, just tossed across the deck like dice. Historians still argue whether these jokes were ritualized, like contests of insults, or just casual banter. Some sagas describe flighting, a formal exchange of poetic insults, half comedy and half duel. Others suggest humor was simply woven into daily life, a way to keep spirits light in the face of hardship. Here's a quirky tidbit. One saga pokes fun at a warrior who was so terrified of chickens that he refused to sit near them, earning him endless ridicule. You can almost hear his crewmates clucking behind him, doubling over with laughter as he tried to maintain dignity. Imagine crossing the North Sea with a man whose greatest enemy was poultry. On your ship, the banter comes alive. A sailor complains about his sore back, and another laughs, telling him he rose like an old woman weaving cloth. The men roar at that, and someone claps the complainer on the shoulder. Another fellow claims he saw a rival crew eat nothing but turnips for a week, and the ship erupts in groans at the thought. You chuckle, too, realizing that laughter here isn't a distraction. It's survival. Between storms, hunger, and endless rowing, humor is a shield as sturdy as any iron. The dragon prow may snarl fiercely, but behind it, men grin, tease, and find joy in absurdities. The ship sways gently, laughter fading into quiet chuckles, then into silence broken only by gulls. You lean back, eyelids heavy, comforted by the realization that even 1,000 years ago, men joked about sore backs, strange fears, and bad meals. Some things you think with a smile never change. The laughter fades, leaving you with time to think about the dragon head itself. You've seen its many faces, guardian, mascot, threat, but still the question lingers. Why did Vikings really carve them? Was it religion, intimidation, art, or all of the above? The truth is slippery, shifting like light on water. Mainstream history offers no single answer. The dragon prow appears across sagas and archaeological finds, but rarely with an explanation. Some historians argue they were spiritual, warding off spirits and monsters, ensuring the sea stage is dangerous enough to respect. Others point to pure psychology. Scare your enemies before you even touch the shore, and you've won half the battle. Still others suggest it was simple pride, like putting a custom paint job on your car. Historians still argue passionately about this. In academic halls, debates rage. Were these ships religious symbols floating across the sea, or practical tools dressed up for flair? Did all crews believe in their protective powers, or did some roll their eyes and call it tradition? The argument stretched like sails in a strong wind, never fully settling. Here's a quirky tidbit. One scholar once proposed that the dragon heads might have been detachable, swapped out depending on purpose, raiding, trading, or ceremonial display. Imagine a Viking rummaging through a shed of spare prows. Shall we take the scary one today, or the slightly less scary one? It's a ridiculous picture, but one that makes you grin as you look at the snarling oak face. On the deck, you hear men discussing it too. One insists the dragon protects them from sea spirits. Another scoffs. saying it's just to make monks faint faster. A third laughs, claiming it's simply because dragons look cooler than sheep. Their disagreement echoes the historians of today, proving that even then, no one fully agreed on the dragon's purpose. You lean back, rocking with the ship, comforted by the uncertainty. Sometimes not knowing is the most human truth of all. The dragon prow watches silently, its meaning layered and unsolved, inviting you to drift between possibilities, as easily as between waking and sleep. The dragon prow stares ahead, but your mind drifts somewhere else, to quiet museum halls, centuries removed from waves and storms. You picture yourself stepping softly across polished floors, fluorescent lights humming above, glass cases glowing faintly in the dim. Inside those cases lie fragments of ships, timbers warped by time, iron rivets rusted to orange dust, and sometimes entire reconstructed hulls that stretch longer than a city bus. Mainstream history have preserved some of these marvels, like the Gokstad and Oseberg ships in Norway, pulled from burial mounds. Their oak planks still curve gracefully, even after 1,000 years underground. Standing before them, visitors whisper instinctively, as though the vessels are not artifacts but sleeping giants, their dragon heads long gone yet still alive in imagination. Historians still argue what stories these finds truly tell. Were the burial ships symbols of elite wealth, or practical vessels retired after faithful service? Did they represent the pinnacle of Viking craftsmanship, or just the everyday standard of the time? Archaeology offers clues, but interpretation drifts as easily as a ship without oars. Here's a quirky tidbit. When the Oseberg ship was first excavated, workers used farm wagons to haul out its treasures. Villagers lined the road, gawking at bundles of tapestries, and carved sleds pulled past their fields. It must have felt surreal, ancient royalty parading by in broad daylight, carried not by warriors but by horses tugging muddy carts. On your imagined deck, you hear sailors joke about being displayed centuries later, their combs and buckles stared at by schoolchildren. One mutters, "At least polish my axe before you put behind glass." The others laugh, unaware of how right he'll be. You close your eyes, letting the vision of the museum blend with the ship beneath you. Timbers creak now as they did then, only the context has shifted. From sea spray to climate-controlled air. You realize that every sound you hear tonight could someday echo faintly in a hall where people walk slowly, whispering, marveling, and perhaps yawning. The dragon prow glistens in your mind, half in oak, half in memory. Whether buried, displayed, or still slicing through waves, it carries the same weight, a silent story of men, myths, and oceans. The museum vision lingers, but soon it fades back into the creak of timbers and the hiss of waves. You blink at the dragon prow again. Its wooden jaw set firm against the horizon, and you realize how deeply it has sunk into the minds of people far beyond the Norse world. Dragons carved into ships are no longer just Viking. They become a cultural echo in art, film, and folklore. Mainstream history aside, you know this image endures because it is simple and powerful. One glance at a snarling prow, and the story writes itself. Mystery, adventure, danger, myth. From children's storybooks to modern movies, Viking ships always carry their dragons, even when historical accuracy wobbles. You've seen them in video games, in cartoons, and blockbusters, each one fiercer and more exaggerated than the last. Historians still argue whether this modern fascination helps or hinders our understanding of the past. Some say it keeps the Norse spirit alive, making history exciting for new generations. Others worry it distorts reality, turning farmers and traders into endless warriors with perfect helmets and fire-breathing ships. Perhaps both are true. Myths thrive when they blur the line between fact and fantasy. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the 19th century, Scandinavian nationalists deliberately revived the dragon ship image as a symbol of identity. They put on postcards, monuments, and even beer labels. Imagine grabbing a pint with a dragon-headed longship stamped on the glass. History reduced to a logo, and yet, somehow, still carrying its ancient power. On deck, the crew doesn't know any of this. They joke, row, and chew their dried fish. But you can almost hear echoes of the future in the sound of the sea against the hull. The dragon prow has outlived them all. Outlived you even. Sailing on an imagination long after the wood has rotted away. You lean back, letting your eyelids sink, Whether in oak or ink, movie reel, or museum glass, the dragon ship endures. It will always glide forward, always watch the horizon, always remind you that even the most practical vessel can become a legend. The dragon's face gleams faintly in the moonlight now, and you feel the ship sliding almost silently through black water. The men are asleep, curled in furs, their snores mixing with the creak of ropes. Only the helmsman stirs, his hand steady on the great steering oar. And as you lie there, half dreaming, the boundary between history and myth begins to blur. Mainstream history admits that sagas often walk the same line, mixing real voyages with supernatural encounters. Dragons on prows mirror dragons in stories. Beasts that lurk beneath seas, giants that toss mountains, gods who disguise themselves as travelers. A longship cutting through fog was never just a ship. It was part of that mythic world, carrying men who believed the extraordinary lurked just beyond the next wave. Historians still argue whether sailors truly expected to meet such creatures or whether the tales were mostly fireside embellishments. Some say sailors swore by sightings of sea serpents. Others dismiss these as whales mistaken in bad weather. Either way, those carved prows capture the possibility of monsters, whether real, imagined, or somewhere in between. Here's a quirky tidbit. A medieval text once described a sea creature so large it was mistaken for an island. Sailors supposedly landed, lit fires, and cooked a meal on its back, only to panic when the island moved. You smile at the absurdity, imagining dinner sliding into the waves while the monster swam lazily away. You watch the dragon prowl, its teeth catching starlight, and imagine it stirring to life. In your drowsy vision, the wood flexes, the jaw yawns, the eyes blink once. The ship doesn't just carry you anymore. It breathes alive in the night, guiding you like a guardian spirit. The sea darkens, but you feel no fear. The dragon leads you forward, past storms, past myths, past the edge of sleep. The waves hush. The timbers murmur. The prow glimmers. You exhale slowly, knowing that whatever lies ahead, monster or mist, saga or silence, you are safe beneath the watch of the dragon. The sea is calmer now than it has ever been, glassy and silver beneath a pale moon. The dragon prow, crusted with salt, no longer snarls. It simply gazes ahead quiet, as though it too is ready to rest. The men lie scattered across the deck, bundled in cloaks. The rhythmic rise and fall of their breathing matching the slow swell of the waves. The longship drifts more than it sails, a cradle rocking gently on the world's largest bed. Mainstream history would tell you that voyages ended with landfall, with triumphant returns or weary docking at some familiar fjord. Yet tonight, your journey doesn't lead back to harbors or markets. It leads inward, into a slow surrender. The dragon, once fierce guardian and terrifying mask, has done its work. You've been carried through myths, storms, markets, rituals, and laughter. Now all that remains is the soft rocking of the sea and the hush of night. Historians still argue about endings too, about when exactly the age of dragon-headed ships faded, whether with Christianization, with kings replacing chieftains, or with new ship designs that left old symbols behind. But for you, right now, the debate doesn't matter. The dragon is still here, patient, steady, watching over the last leg of your voyage into sleep. Here's a quirky tidbit to carry you across that threshold. In some Norse stories, dragons weren't always enemies. They were keepers of wisdom, their coils guarding secrets deep underground. And maybe that's what your dragon prow's been doing all along. Not just scaring enemies or spirits, but keeping safe the quiet knowledge that journeys, however fierce, must always end in rest. The sea sighs. The ropes creak softly. Your breath slows, and the dragon prow fades into shadow, no longer snarling, no longer glaring. Just a silent companion pointing into the infinite. The wind down begins. The pacing eases. Words stretch like long waves rolling gently toward shore. You imagine the horizon dimming, the stars softening overhead. The dragon head, once sharp in detail, blurs at its edges until it becomes only a shape, then only a memory. The voices of the crew vanish, leaving only the hush of water slipping along planks. That sound becomes softer still, like the faintest hum of a lullaby. You let your body sink, each muscle loosening, as though you are lying not on ruffle but on moss, or on clouds, or on the very sea itself made soft. Every image you've carried tonight drifts further away. The chisels carving oak, the painted shields rattling, the laughter about chickens and butter fines. Even the storms and markets fade, until all that remains is the rhythm of breath, the rocking of waves, and the comfort of knowing you are held by a ship, by a story, by time itself. You let your eyes close fully now, knowing the dragon watches for you. You don't need to stand guard. You don't need to row. You don't need to question whether the tales were true or false. You are safe in the quiet, safe in the slow, safe in the space where history becomes dream. The last thing you feel is the sea's embrace, steady, timeless, infinite. It rocks you gently, endlessly, whispering that all voyages end here, in stillness, in calm, in sleep.